All right, welcome everyone. Today I'll just be kind of presenting this concept of what I've been calling negative pragmatism. I take a lot of influence from, I think Julie Resch kind of really got me on the whole negative train. But, you know, there's been a lot of things that have happened in between then. So I've been throwing around this topic, this idea of negative pragmatism, uh, mainly to combat the the maximization of efficiency and productivity, which for me is concerning. Um, but we're still. You could say that the idea of pragmatism is still complicated. um, so what is negative pragmatism? Well, we don't really know yet. But negative pragmatism circles around two questions. What are we doing with our lack, and what can we do with our lack? The next question would be, what is lack? And this is lack is already a very hard topic to even define, but kind of like the consensus of everybody that I've talked to, is lack in a sort of very simplistic way is that which is present and absent. There's several ways that we can approach this, but we can go into a deep hole if we keep talking about this. But I don't want to undermine this in the sense that a lot of the reason why negative pragmatism is sort of hard to get a grips with is precisely because we're still trying to really define, refine our understanding of exactly what is a lack. But so that being said, I'm going to present several accounts borrowed from several conversations that I've had that I have found very useful in my thinking about negative pragmatism. And all of these accounts these are conversations that are still ongoing. Um, so I'll be presenting a couple of people and their ideas, but again, anything could change from here. But this is sort of just the summary account of what I've gathered so far in this idea of negative pragmatism. So my dear friend Thomas Jockin here, he asserts about two things. Um, he acknowledges the subjective account of lack, but he is very adamant about arguing the idea that lack is real. There is something ontological about lack. So it's not just simply a psychological thing. There is something in reality that itself is lacking. And then he has his account of virtual knowledge. And basically, it's this idea of virtual knowledge that kind of prevents us from really understanding what lack is. An example of this would be this idea of mistaking the lack as nothing. My famous example is going from meaning to meaninglessness. Meaninglessness assumes that the lack is nothing, rather than the meaning itself is insufficient. This would be kind of one example of Thomas Jockin's idea of like virtual knowledge is preventing you from accounting of lack. Then I have my conversation with Chetan. We talked a lot about negentropy and entropy. Um, to give context to this specific account that Chetan kind of helped me with is that negentropy for Chetan is not really the opposite of entropy, but more like the slowing down of entropy. He pointed out to me that when we talk about this idea of utility and efficiency, we're sort of maximizing the structure or the thing, and we're basically in some sense like killing it. But this is kind of like the little bit of the metaphor that we used. or the analogy that we used. Um, and this is kind of like what he was telling me about. Like it's kind of like the death drive, like us maximizing and resorting to efficiency is kind of uh, utilizing the death drive to its max. Basically, we're basically killing things a lot faster this way by maximizing and utilizing towards efficiency. Um, so this idea of negentropy, slowing down entropy, which we kind of talked about, is entropy is kind of sort of analogous to the death drive. Negentropy you can kind of look at as the way he described it to me is kind of like taking the scenic route with the drive. I mean, the drive is still going to do what it does, right? We're still going to get to what the death drive wants, but um, in some sense, I mean, meaning the idea of destruction. But we can do a kind of scenic route with the death drive, which is also a kind of site of creativity that can be possible. But Chetan kind of gave me the idea of negentropic habits, which is something similar to basically using lack, well, not using, but more like allowing lack to slow down uh, the entropic process rather than maximizing for efficiency and so on. Chetan kind of gives an example of beauty as something that's kind of virtually useless. That's like one example. He does note that there are some problems with that example because, I mean, you could say like beauty can be used. The other thing is that uh, he talked about this idea of repetitions, and how we could probably form these habits. Um, there is this kind of notion that we should allow the repetition to take place. We should observe and allow the repetition to take place to meet its end. One example that I have that I found useful was my idea of my failure with writing, meaning like for a long time I've wanted to be a long form writer, and I repeatedly tried to become a long form writer, but eventually I started enjoying being a short form writer. And so, in some sense, Chitan is pointing out that we have a tendency to interfere with the repetition, and that prevents the repetition from reaching its end. Meaning that if I had, meaning that once I accepted, in some sense, or once I forgot about my obsession with becoming a long form writer, I kept writing anyways in my short form, and eventually allowed it to reach its end, and now I enjoy it. There's a sense of real fulfillment that you can have with letting the repetition reach its end. Of course, there's some still complications, some more things that we should think about with all of this. Then there's my conversation with Espacea. Um, And my conversation with Espacea was mainly around relationships and emotions. In my recent engagement with Espacea, she kind of notes to me this idea that um, when we talk about emotions, it seems that emotions require lack or require the need of a gap in order for us to make actual real connection to them, rather than closing them off. Um, And then the other part is that we can think of relations as primary. This is like another form of, you could say, negative pragmatism, that relations are primary over productivity. In some sense, when we think about actually cultivating relations, they're kind of useless in a sense. Um, at least they're not. At least they're not as useful in the sense that we take them. They're not. You could say that relations aren't really a kind of productivity. Really, establishing relations aren't a productivity, but there is something happening in cultivating relations, um, primarily because we both lack as subjects. So there's something to be said more about that. And then finally, I have Andrew Luber, who's also a dear friend of mine. Um, he points out in the negative pragmatic symposium that there's an irony of lack, which he kind of made it a challenging problem to even think about negative pragmatism, meaning like if we are advocating for lack and its awareness, this makes lack explicit, and then we get ourselves um, in this irony where once we made the lack explicit, we encounter another lack without really knowing that's the new lack that is there. So, and then perhaps I'm not explaining the account entirely correct, but basically Luber's main point was that lack must be non-explicit. We must let the lack be, whatever, and that would be, in some sense, being pragmatic about lack, letting the lack be, rather than making it such a concept of awareness and so on. And I guess I could see Luber's point in this because if we are advocating for sort of awareness of lack, there's that possible tendency to then utilize lack as a kind of like mode of efficiency and utilization. Um, and this kind of bodes well with Chetan's account of the fact that we can use uselessness things too. Like uselessness can be used. That's the contradiction that we find ourselves in. Um, and then some final ideas. I guess it didn't show my other I guess it didn't show my other account. Um, my other account would be let me see if it's showing. Ah, here it is. Okay. So my other account is, and then okay, so this is my last account. These are my speculations basically. I'm sorry, I couldn't find the other part. I don't know why it wasn't connected, but okay. So ideas that I'm playing with now is this idea of the death drive, which is sort of really related to a lot of the accounts that was shared um, between like Chetan and Luber and Aspasea. Um, the problem that we would have in thinking the death drive would probably be in relation to um, Thomas Jockin's account of lacks are ontological. How can I connect lack as ontological, not just merely subjective, in relation to the death drive? And because the death drive is sometimes connected to a merely psychological account, the unconscious, I've been thinking, how can we relate that? It might be the death drive also might be a good mediation point between Thomas Jockin's idea of that lacks are really ontological. Like why would we fail to understand that lacks are ontological? And I think using the death drive might be a mediation to realizing why we are prevented from understanding this. Here I quote Sabina Spielrein because I actually like Julie Resch's emphasis on Sabina Spielrein. This idea that the destructive drive, even though it comes from the reproduction drive, is both destructive and the very drive that allows coming into being. With that being said, I'm still playing with those ideas. I don't really have much to say on that account, but um, because I've been thinking about the death drive a little bit more, I was thinking that uh, one thing is, I think for sure, about when we talk about pragmatism, is that negative pragmatism is not supposed to be um, an alternative to pragmatism. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily the antithesis to. I mean, it sort of is, but like what I'm trying to say is we still need pragmatism as such. That's just how the world is going to function. But what I'm trying to say is that when all that we have is the pragmatism that we have today, or these notions of efficiency and utilization, if that's all that we have today, um, then the death drive is just acting the way that it does. Um, but what I am proposing in some sense is, how do we work with the death drive? Um, because in many ways, the way people are maximizing efficiency and utility is actually, um, it's another ironic working with the death drive, because they're sort of maximizing it. Um, but another way of, I think, working with the death drive is sort of allowing, um, the utility and efficiency to be destroyed. And once we allow efficiency and utility to be destroyed, we can, in connection to Sabina's speedrun, we can allow something to come to be. The question is, the question that is horrifying, at least in the subjective sense, is that, what is this coming to be? Um, and so my inverse of negative pragmatism is basically this idea, and this is something that we came up with in the negative pragmatic symposium, is that actually we should let lack orient us, rather than orienting around lack. Orienting around lack is basically always trying to resist the death drive, and what it's partaking. But of course, there's much more. I mean, I think really the big question is thinking lack ontologically, but there's still a lot to even think within this area of, what does a negative pragmatism actually look like. Have only one speculative form, I have several speculative forms that I just shared with all of you. The one that I have now is this idea of allowing utility and efficiency to be destroyed without trying to recover it. Um, sort of letting it be. But yeah, anyways, that's kind of like the crux of everything that is happening. So hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. And that's it. Okay.